Okie doke, let's see and get caught up on the community tab here. Whoa. Almost 1,000 of you want to see me overclock a Ryzen 3400G. Well, I mean, GPU market's still terrible, so let's go. What's going on, guys? Dan with PC Tech Hustle coming at you with another video, and today we're doing some overclocking here on a system I built about a month ago, that being the Ryzen 5 3400G system. But also, before we do that, just a quick recap of the system as it's installing some updates behind me. The system is a Ryzen 5 3400G, so that is basically the flagship APU that you can buy outside of some of the APUs that are in systems that are in system integrators. Yeah, we did cover that in a video before. That actually, I do have a Ryzen 7 4700G, though this isn't something you can just go out and buy. And for RAM, we got 16 gigs of Corsair LPX, 3000 megahertz, cast latency 16 RAM. Not super fast in the RAM department, but honestly, for an APU, you really don't want to go over 3200 megahertz. 3600 I'd say be your absolute ceiling, and the difference between 3200 and 3600 for an APU is. So that about covers the system, what we're up to, what we want to do. We're going to cover the video in two parts. Basically, it's going to be just a measurement of the system in its stock state, stock out of the box, without any overclocks applied, just as if you freshly built it. I'll go through that with you in the BIOS too and show you that we will reset everything to stock defaults, and then run some benchmarks, which we're really going to be focused on doing some synthetic benchmarks, being Cinebench, Firestrike, and TimeSpy, just as the best controls for benchmarks as we can possibly get. And then maybe we'll come back and maybe throw Modern Warfare at it to see, did we get a bit of a boost from when we previously benchmarked it in the previous video. I'll try to run through and rifle through the tutorial of the overclock. There really isn't much to it in terms of an APU, so hopefully we can get through that quick, run some benchmarks, get our stock numbers, and then proceed with the overclocks. Alrighty guys, so let's jump into the BIOS. I'll show you how to do that real quick, but also one quick mention too. You definitely can do these overclocks with software. There is the Ryzen Master software, which isn't a bad product at all. It's just something I guess I'm kind of a more old school overclocker, and I like to do everything from the BIOS. Plus, if you do things from the BIOS, all the settings stick and you don't ever have to worry about it really ever. Just set it and go. So it's kind of what I like to do. It's kind of my personal preference. If you guys want to tinker around with Ryzen Master, I'll put a link in the description so you guys can go take a look at that, but this video is not really focused on that. We're just doing things in the BIOS. Again, it's what I would recommend. But so let's take a look at how to get into the BIOS, as if you're stumbling on this video and you want to know how to do that, because we're doing some overclocking. So let's do that first. So what you want to do here is you want to come over to your start button. Now there's two ways to do this. You can hold the shift button and then do a restart, and then it'll present you with some Windows options to actually boot into EFI. You can do that. I think there's a few extra steps involved with doing so, but honestly the easiest way I've always recommended to people is just come over here, just do a normal restart, which we'll do here right now. And as it's restarting, you want to wait to see when the screen goes black, which it did, and then just come over to your keyboard and just mash the delete button until you basically are put into the BIOS screen. So that's what we're doing here, right now. Voila, there we go. So it's as simple as that. Again, there is another way to do it through Windows, through boot options, but again, I don't necessarily recommend it because this is just dead simple. Okay guys, as mentioned, we are in the BIOS now. The BIOS menus are obviously going to look different depending on your motherboard and actually depending on what settings you actually are in. I've been tinkering with the BIOS before recording this video, so it actually put me into the advanced mode. But if this is your first time booting into your BIOS and you actually have a Gigabyte board like I do, the Gigabyte B450 DS3H, then you might actually be in what's called kind of easy mode, which I have here on the screen. And basically what this is, it's just kind of some basic menus on how to navigate a few things. You can actually set some settings on some things, but if you'll notice here, it'll say hit F2 for classic, or you can just simply click on it, and that's what's going to take you into the more advanced features, which we're interested in. Alrighty, so then within the advanced features, as we mentioned too, the video is a two-part where we're going to go into just setting default out of the box settings as if you just built the system and you're just booting into Windows trying to get some stock numbers. So we want to get the stock controlled values with the benchmarks that we're going to be running. And then later on I'll mention some other stability tools that were used to actually just test and verify our overclocks, but we'll get into that later. But anyway, what we want to do is make sure the board is set to its default out of the box settings, and all you got to do that is just arrow over to, usually this is synonymous actually with all motherboard types, save and exit settings, where you can load profiles and make some other various small changes. But the big thing that we're interested in is the load optimized defaults. Again, this is pretty synonymous with all motherboard manufacturers. So we'll come over here to load optimized defaults, hold our mouse or arrow over to it, hit enter, and hit yes. But then we're actually going to have to save those settings and boot into Windows. Basically another synonymous option with all BIOSes within the last 10 to 15 years out of all motherboard manufacturers. Just hit the F10 button. It'll prompt you to save configuration and exit. We just want to hit yes, enter, and then the system will go through a reboot. And then once you're done, you'll be back into Windows, where we can start running our stock benchmarks. Alrighty guys, so we are back in Windows. Very simple stuff there. Now again, what we're gonna do is we wanna get stock numbers, and I just chose some synthetic benchmarks, mainly because they're pretty strong in their control. We're not having to rely on like an internet connection. We wanna see basically our true change in values when we do these overclocks. So obviously you wanna put it through the tests on doing other gaming exercises and testing, which we'll try to get to at the end of the video. I know Modern Warfare kind of struggled with this system, so I think that'll be a good test to check out to see what our overclocks net us in the end. But what we're doing here real quick is we're just gonna run through a quick little, I guess, montage of some stock benchmarks. And then immediately following that, we're gonna go back into the BIOS, and I'm gonna show you guys the exact settings that you need to set to basically net yourself an overclock that's basically the maximum stable overclock. Overclocking takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. It's very tedious. It's hours and hours worth of work. And to take you guys through that in this video, it would be one, extremely boring, and two, obviously the video would just be so long. So anyway, I'm just gonna show you guys the basic stuff to set and where to identify and set those. Know that your results may vary depending on your motherboard, depending on the bin of the CPU, blah, 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 but somewhere could be a good starting point for you guys. So anyway, let's queue up those stock benchmarks. But then next, basically, when you see my face on camera, we'll be back in the BIOS, and I will be discussing where and how to make some of these changes, and then we'll see what our final overclock numbers actually net us. Alrighty guys, so stock numbers are now established. We have a baseline to work from. Now it's time for some overclocks. Now again, as I mentioned, I found the perfect overclock for this chip. I spent many, many hours doing that for you guys. So main purpose of that is keeping the video short and to the point, but secondly, giving you guys an area to establish as a point of reference. What I found is this chip likes to operate at 4 gigahertz out of the box. If you go up to 4.1, 4.2, it starts getting really dicey. You have to apply a lot of voltage to get there. I don't really recommend that. And for 1 to 200 megahertz, it's such a huge diminishing return, doesn't make any sense. But also, here's a good thing. With 4 gigahertz, we're actually able to undervolt the CPU, more on that in just a moment, to keep it even cooler than the stock numbers at a higher clock speed, which is really cool. So then second thing that we're gonna also apply is a graphics overclock to the APU. So we're gonna bump up the clock speed another 300 megahertz, add just a tiny bit more voltage to get there, which again, I'll show you. And that will obviously net us some better performance in graphics. Lastly, and which is very important for Ryzen, is applying the XMP profile, which gets the RAM operating at its maximum stable frequency. So all three of those things to consider when doing APU overclocking. So obviously a little bit different of a situation if you're doing APU overclocking like we're doing here versus some type of normal CPU that doesn't have integrated graphics. So let's cut on over to the screen here real quick for you guys, show you guys what to change, and explain a couple of things here and there, especially with this Gigabyte BIOS, because it's got some things that are a little quirky, and that is actually just centric to Gigabyte, fortunately. So let's talk about that. Alrighty guys, so here we are over on the BIOS, and the main things that you want to be concerned with navigating to, we'll get to here shortly, but one of the main things that we want to first step into is the advanced frequency control. Now, most all motherboards will have these features there somewhere. Where it may be if you're not using a Gigabyte motherboard will vary, so basically find something that would allow you to get to these types of settings, which is going to be an area where you're going to be applying graphics and CPU clock adjustments. So within our Gigabyte motherboard, it's the first menu option, and we're gonna first come down to working on the CPU. Now, as you can see, the clock ratio is set to auto, and that is as it would be out of the box with no setting changes whatsoever. So as you can see on the right-hand side, it's saying a 37 value, which means 3.7 gigahertz. So as I mentioned too before, 4 gigahertz is our max stable overclock that I was able to achieve within Ryzen. So we're gonna go ahead and apply that, and that's as simple as changing this value as you hover over it to a 40, and that, as you can see below that, changes the clock speed now from 3.7 to 4 gigahertz. So that basically takes care of the overclocking portion of applying the clocks to get it up to 4 gigahertz, but we have a couple other things we're going to look at on this menu specifically. Again, that may vary depending on the BIOS and the motherboard you're using, but with this specifically, the Gigabyte motherboard, the settings we're interested in is still here on this menu. So next thing we want to do is apply a graphics clock frequency change. As I mentioned, we're going to be doing some overclocking on the graphics APU side of things. All right, so then for the graphics clock frequency, it's set to auto, and auto out of the box hits about 1400 megahertz. We want to take it up to 1700. So what you can simply do is hit the plus and minus keys here, and you can actually do that here earlier as well, where we applied the 40 value on the CPU overclock, or we can simply type in the value we want to achieve, which is 1700 megahertz. So a 300 megahertz boost, higher than the maximum value that the chip operates at its stock value. Now with the overclock for the graphics, we have to also give it a little bit more voltage, and oddly enough, that's actually located on this same menu, where the CPU voltage control is on a different menu, which we'll get to here in just a moment. But with the graphics voltage, we're going to take it up to a 1.125. So you can go up a bit more, and I've tested that, but again, you kind of run into the same situation where you're having to really apply a lot more voltage to get very diminishing returns. So it's not worth it, and this is what I found as basically the highest maximum stable overclock that I could achieve without having to go into dangerous levels. All right, so basically that takes care of the CPU and graphics overclocking as far as applying the clock values and the voltage for the graphics. Last thing here on this menu here, we want to enable the XMP profile, which is basically a profile that's negotiated between the manufacturers of motherboards and memory to give us the max stable frequency and voltages of the memory to get it operating as best as we can. And we want that with Ryzen because Ryzen is very sensitive to memory. So enabling the XMP profile is dead simple. As you can see right now, we're operating at a basic auto frequency of 2133. We know this memory can go up to 3000 megahertz. So what we're going to do is just hit enter, arrow down to profile 1, and enable it. And as you can see, what that does is it makes a lot of adjustments on the timings. It actually, if you look deeper into what it happens, it actually applies some different voltage values, as well as obviously takes it up to 3000 megahertz, which we want. So now we are done with this menu. So to navigate back to the previous menu, all we have to do is hit escape, come down to the advanced voltage settings, because we've got to tune the voltage. And now for what we're doing here, actually, we don't have to actually apply extra voltage to the CPU, but I want to go over this with you guys because commonly Ryzen CPUs do kind of add more voltage than what is necessary. So I took the time to find the maximum stable overclock that I could achieve as highest clock speed, but then I also wanted to see how much voltage it really needed to run. So what I found is we can actually undervolt the CPU to get us a lower temperature operation with the highest clock stable possible. So in order to do that on most motherboards, it's as simple as applying a value here where you see the CPU V core, and you can do plus or minus to get you the values you want. Obviously 1.8 volts is extremely dangerous, don't ever do that, but you can put in something like 1.4 volts and be done. I've done that with ASRock boards, I've done that with MSI boards, never had an issue with that, but for some reason this particular either BIOS version of the B450 AS3DH, I'm not sure if it's synonymous with other Gigabyte boards, but when you apply a hard value here, it doesn't really stick. It doesn't do anything actually. So actually what you have to do is you have to set this back to, if we go back to where it is normally at auto, we want to set it to quote unquote normal mode. So if we hit the N key, there we go. So what that does, as you can see, is it unlocks a dynamic V-core adjustment. So this is where you can apply offsets to the voltage either negatively or positively, and these settings stick. So it's something that I had to go out and find, and actually I had no idea of, and I was actually struggling for a while because I kept applying just a base value of voltage and it wasn't doing anything. But then I stumbled on a video from Tech Yes City where he actually explicitly points that out. He's done a lot more overclocking than I have, and he says with these Gigabyte boards you actually have to apply the offsets, which we do here. So as mentioned, we want a more negative offset because we're undervolting the CPU. So if you just keep hitting the minus key, it'll keep adjusting the values lower, lower, and lower, and lower. So where I found the chip to be happy was at a negative 0.0625, and then that is it. Again, the idea here is to give you guys an area and a place to establish a baseline to basically start configuring your chip. Obviously, with your motherboard, your BIOS version, and your CPU, all things may vary and may be ever so slightly different. But at least this is an area where you can go make those tunes in those same areas. Or if you're using a Gigabyte board like I am and your setup is exactly the same, then basically set it and go and you're done, and you got the maximum performance out of your chip possible. So obviously, the last thing what we want to do here is hit F10 to save. And there we go. Now, one thing I might suggest too is apply a profile that you can set. And if you go to the last menu item in your BIOS where it says save and exit, you can select and create a profile. You know, if something were to ever happen and you lose your settings, you can just immediately apply that, and you don't have to always apply every one of those settings individually. Alrighty guys, so we are booted back into Windows, and obviously you want to make sure that after applying the values that we did in the BIOS that indeed does happen. But we are not 100% done. The thing that you have left to do is to ensure stability. So stability meaning that the settings that you set are going to be okay and stable long term. So I mentioned a quick couple tools that I've already used to ensure stability of the machine. As we mentioned earlier, that we found the highest achievable overclock, but the things that you want to be on the lookout for first, obviously, are your temperatures, your clock speeds, your voltages, all that stuff. And a great tool to look into for that, I would refer you to HWinfo64. It's a free download on the internet. Go grab that. It definitely can help you keep an eye on these things, especially when you're overclocking, because you want to be paying really close attention to that. But those are just monitoring tools, and you want to get a stability tool, and my favorite is ADA64, which is a free download. However, it is trial-based. After 30 days, it'll ask you to buy it. It is actually relatively cheap to buy, which I typically do because I do so many systems, but if you're just looking for a quick test on your stability, grab that, run it for about 30 minutes, make sure everything is nice and good, and then run it for extended periods of time after that if you don't have any crashes or anything like that. But then you need to be able to stress out the GPU, and in our case it's the APU, but you want to be able to put that through a maximum utilization, high stress test. And the tools I like to use for that is Heaven Benchmark, an oldie goldie tool, as well as Furmark, again old. But the reason I like those tools is you can just continuously cycling and running them over and over and over to ensure that you have stability of your graphics overclock. If you get through those stable without any crashes over an extended period of time, I'd say you're pretty good. But overall, you want to ensure full system stability based on the things that you would normally do on a PC. Go play some of your favorite video games. Go hit up some YouTube videos. I've got plenty of those for you to go check out. Compile a Word document, write an email, do all those things long term to ensure full stability of your system. But to insert one last comment to you guys and to remain completely transparent, that not all overclocks are created equal. You might run into a blue screen, you might run into a frozen app or something like that where you might have to go back into the BIOS, add a little bit more voltage, decrease a little bit of the clock speed. This was designed to be a template for you to work with, not necessarily a end-all be-all overclocking guide that would work for all variations of the Ryzen 3400G platform. If you have exactly this setup, then you're pretty much in good hands where you can just set things and go, but obviously you want to do your stability checks. You want to ensure you're overclocked. Again, I didn't want to make this video super long because going through all the nitty-gritties of overclocking takes a long time. I obviously cut out a bunch of the stuff here just so you guys have really just points of reference to work from. However, with all that said, let's cue up those final benchmarks and see if this overclock took us to brand new warp speeds.
Warp 1, engage!
Alrighty guys, so benchmarks are in, and man, I am really excited to report what we saw there. And obviously you already had seen through the benchmarks. We made some substantial improvements in the synthetic benchmarks, Cinebench, Firestrike, and TimeSpy. But I think the coolest thing was seeing the improvement that we made with Warzone, and it definitely improved. Now the game's still running at the lowest settings possible to actually be somewhat playable on an APU, and also playability is a relative term. You know, some people, their playability definition is 60 frames per second or at the lowest or bust. Okay, but that's probably with a high-end system with a GPU. We're messing around with an APU. So I think this speaks miles to, if you're holding out for a GPU and you build up a system, know that you can throw an APU in there and for the most part do some pretty awesome gaming, especially if you're taking this guide and overclocking it a little bit to give you that little bit extra bit more performance for absolutely free. But anywho guys, I hope you at least found the video informative and entertaining in a sense of getting a grasp on what it takes to do some overclocking on these APUs. And if you did, make sure you give the video a like, as it definitely helps me out more than you know with the YouTube algorithm. Get subscribed to the channel if you aren't already. Thanks for tuning into this one though. I appreciate your time, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.